Hey guys, what is up? SuperKmanrocks here, and I am here for my MSI Day 8 overview and analysis video. It's the final day of lower bracket round number 2. One team will be eliminated by the end of today's series, and I think we all have kind of an idea of who that is going to be. This is certainly a mismatch on paper, but it's League of Legends. Anything can happen, and I think we're all hoping that the series is a lot closer than maybe we anticipated it would be going into the day. Of course, if you want to know my thoughts on this entire tournament as a whole, you can check out any of the videos that are listed up in the iCard right now. Up there is not only going to be my main stage bracket prediction, but also my MSI primer video from before the tournament started. That's going to have a detailed breakdown of every single team at the tournament, how they like to play the game, their strengths and weaknesses, etc., etc. They're also power ranked if you want a good idea of where I think a lot of them land. And then also linked up there is going to be the playlist to every single video that I've made at MSI up to this point. We've covered every single game at the tournament, so if you want to know what I think of any of those, any of the previous series, you can go ahead and check that playlist out. But today, we're going to be talking about our final round 2 lower bracket series, and I want to know what you guys think down in the comment section below. Let me know who you thought was going to win. Obviously, there certainly was a favorite going into this, but I'd love to hear you guys' thoughts and feedback. Let's get right into it, though. I don't want to waste too much of your time. What we do on this channel is go game by game, talking about the advantages and the disadvantages that each team had in each individual game. We'll give out a player of the game, a dead of the game, and at the end of the series, I will give out a player of the series as well. But today, we are going to be covering a matchup that I think a lot of people are seeing, like I've said a couple of times already, as not particularly close, but obviously, again, anything can happen in League of Legends, and there certainly are some things at the very least that you can point to as possibilities. We have a matchup between the number 1 seed from the LCK in Gen.G and the number 1 seed from the LCS in Cloud9. Certainly an intriguing matchup on paper, mostly because, again, it's NA versus the LCK's number 1 seed. This isn't something that I think a lot of people are going to be looking at as a particularly close series, but if you have followed the channel, you'll know that I actually do think Cloud9 going into the tournament looked like the best Western team coming out of Spring Split. Now, has that held up entirely at the tournament? I think it's you can be the judge of that, you know, that it's certainly up for debate. I think G2 is certainly in that category, but Cloud9 I do think at the very least deserves to be mentioned. They weren't able to take a game off of BLG, but they looked competitive in all 3 of those games, and they were just simply better than Golden Guardians in their series, and so there are things to like about Cloud9, and Gen.G coming off of a excruciatingly close Game 5 loss to T1 is certainly going to be you know, on their mind, and I think they're going to be motivated in that way, but I actually hate this matchup for Cloud9. I think, in particular, this is maybe the worst matchup they could have at the entire tournament, because what Cloud9 is really good at is being able to secure themselves in the mid to late game and be able to team fight really well. That's what they do well, but Gen.G might just be the best team at doing that in the entire world, basically negating all of Cloud9's major advantages as a team. Now, you could maybe see a world in which Cloud9 could do well in the early game. I do think they have a lot of good talent. Everybody knows I'm super high on both Blabber and Berserker in terms of, you know, comparing them to international competition, but you're going to have everybody on the team step up. The solo laners are going to have to be good enough. The supports are going to have to, or the support is going to have to be good enough. And for Gen.G, like, I don't have that same kind of question when it comes to whether or not these players are going to succeed. They have incredibly good talent, and they've beaten better teams in the past than Cloud9. And so Gen.G definitely the favorite here. I picked them to win 3-0 in my previous video. But again, let me know what you think down in the comment section below. It's time to jump into the analysis, of course. Going game by game means that we get to kick it off with game number 1. And the winner of game number 1 was Gen.G. They are able to take the first game in this series. Not surprising, but this was a stomp. This game was not close really at all at any moment. There really weren't a lot of plays that went in favor of Cloud9. Now, there were a couple of players, in my opinion, that did play relatively well, but you got to give a lot of credit to Gen.G. They controlled the whole map. They drafted a very oppressive team comp to try and play into, and I actually love this draft coming out from Gen.G. I think it gives you a ridiculous amount of options, not only in the early game, but also in the late game. And obviously, you know, I've talked about Blitzcrank in the past in general as a pick, especially when you're the better team. Blitzcrank can often look like a super broken, busted pick. We've seen it a lot in the LPL in particular, but, you know, Gen.G pulling it out here isn't particularly surprising. It can take advantage of a lot of the positioning mistakes that Cloud9 is making, and obviously that's a little bit of a spoiler alert for how important this Blitzcrank ended up being. But Let's go ahead and talk about how we ended up getting there, because this game was, at the very least, something to talk about. There were a lot of things that happened in this game that I think are worthy of talking about. So let's go ahead and start it. Gen.G does get a pretty big early lead, and this is a catastrophe for Cloud9. I was talking about this in the preview. If Cloud9's going to win these games, they're likely going to have to get a lead early. They're probably not going to be able to ever, play from neutral against a team like Gen.G. They're going to have to be able to win lane phase, generate a gold lead, and then actually try to do something with it in the mid game. Just be too aggressive and too fast for Gen.G's, slower pace style to be able to catch up. That's probably the only way that I could see Cloud9 winning this series. And so for Gen.G to have such a big lead coming out of the early game, and for a lot of the plays that Cloud9 are making to go in Gen.G's favor, at the very least neutral, it's just not a good sign. Funge ends up getting dove top for First Blood. He does trade 1-for-1, which is solid, and then there's another 1-for-1 down in the bot lane because Berserker is really good, but for the most part, these plays are definitely Gen.G set up, and Cloud9's just trying to react and trying to stabilize in these scenarios, and then Fudge really starts to get abused a lot in this early game. This Scion was certainly not a positive for Cloud9. We'll talk about it a bit more as we go further along into the game, but he didn't feel particularly comfortable on this pick. He ends up being way too aggro in the top lane. He ends up playing way too far forward and getting punished by Peanut, and then he gets ganked again and ends up dying. It feels like just, a consistent stream of income in the top lane for Gen.G. They really don't have a lot of answers for it on the side of Cloud9, because you don't really want to invest a ton into the Scion, but he's also losing hard enough where he's giving a lot of things over to the Kha'Zix, and especially the Ornn, who's going to be a little bit of an issue in the late game. And so a lot of Gen.G's advantage is coming on the top side, but it certainly isn't the only part of the map that they're actively winning. Fudge is definitely boosted in this game, and we'll talk about that a bit more as we go along, but Sven also had a particularly awful game on the Lulu, just consistently out of position, and that's really where the Blitzcrank comes in. I mean, Delight couldn't miss a hook this game, but I'm not even really going to put it a ton on Delight. It really was just Cloud9 being super far forward when they really do not have the ability to do so. They just played so disrespectfully the entire game, is I think the word I'm looking for, that it became very easy for Gen.G to punish a lot of their mistakes, and Sven was consistently the target of Blitzcrank hooks, and the Lulu's just not going to be able to survive that, especially pre-6, and so Sven, Fudge continue to be a little bit of a problem. Blabber, caught out in River, ends up giving over first and second Herald, essentially, to the side of Gen.G, and they use that really, really well. And then basically the best way I can describe the late game is that Gen.G just dominates every single late game team fight, mostly from this ridiculous CC chain that comes in from Blitzcrank hook into Nautilus hook into Ornn knockup. Like in all of this time, Jinx is just free firing on the backline, and you've got a Kha'Zix jumping in on the enemy backline. There's just not enough time for Cloud9 to be able to do anything, especially with the gold deficit that they're already in. They end up giving over Baron basically for free because Blabber dies trying to get into the pit, and there really is no steal attempt. Gen.G try to end in the top lane, but they're not able to do it, so they just go bot lane and win a fight and end the game there. I mean, it's just a blowout. This really wasn't close at all. Game 1 was not a fun one to watch if you're an NA fan, and I think that's a good thing if you are a Gen.G fan. If you're looking at this from Gen.G's perspective, they looked fantastic across every part of this game. My player of the game is going to go to Delight in the support position again, because Blitzcrank is just such a massive pick. We've seen this a lot when the Blitzcrank gets pulled out at the pro level. There are obviously some comps that you don't want to play it into, and you certainly don't want to play it, blind or from behind, but if you can get into that position where anybody you hook as Blitzcrank is going to be positive, where you can hook the Scion in and you still have to ult him as Lulu, like, that's massive. There's really no anti-value, I guess, when it comes to having the Blitzcrank on your team, and Delight was absolutely massive for them in this game. I'm not entirely saying it was his play. Like, he didn't play bad. He played great, and in fact, he hit a lot of hooks that he really, needed to hit that really changed the direction of the game, but Cloud9 certainly made it a lot easier on him to play this Blitzcrank champion with their positioning. Sven just consistently walking into, face-checking empty brushes and just dying for no reason. Like, I can't even begin to wrap my head around it. Peanut was really good on the Kha'Zix, was just consistently attacking the Scion top lane, and for that, Dorian was also really good, even if he was solo killed by Eminus at one point in this game, and then Pays did everything he was supposed to. Chovy was solid on the Nautilus, even if he was out-farmed, which is certainly not the Chovy experience. There just isn't a lot to talk about on the side of Gen.G, because really all they did was capitalize on the mistakes that Cloud9 made. They did make good plays. They were constantly going to objectives, but it was mostly Cloud9 being bad, and that's really the story of game number 1 for me, is Cloud9 just being really bad. And honestly, a lot of teams at this tournament have been a lot worse than I was anticipating. I think the skill level at this tournament is actually a lot lower than what a lot of these teams were showing off in their regional finals, and I don't really know why that is. I don't know, what about this tournament means that a lot of teams are just playing a little bit more, a little less, I would say, secure in their leads, but Cloud9 is certainly one of those teams that just seems to have forgotten how to play the game. Maybe some of the things they got away with in NA are just kind of too much to get away with here, but these are mistakes that they're just not making in the LCS. Fudge is going to be my dud of the game. The dude just consistently pushed forward and died over and over and over again. This was a miserable Sion game. I don't want to see him on this champion the rest of the series. I just don't. This was not a champion that I think he could play at a high level. Even in a tank versus tank matchup, he looked completely outclassed. Sven as well was really bad. Again, consistently just face-checking brushes to immediately die to a Blitzcrank. I mean, at some point, you have to realize that you can't do that anymore. And I don't really understand what he was thinking. He was consistently walking up, basically with no reason, and this is a champion that he really hasn't done that a lot on over the course of this year. Blabber wasn't particularly good on the Poppy. He certainly didn't get any objectives, and he certainly didn't pressure the enemy team at all. Certainly no ganks as well. And then Eminus and Berserker had moments. Eminus gets his solo kill onto Doran. He was kind of bad outside of that, but was fine. I would say certainly wasn't the biggest problem. And Berserker's positioning was actually fantastic in this game. There just isn't a lot that he can do when the rest of his team is just kind of running it down and he gets at this major gold deficit. And so for Cloud9, there's a lot to fix. There is absolutely a lot to fix as you go into game number 2, because game number 1 was a disaster. And I would say game number 2 is a must-win. If you go down 0-2, especially with how game number 1 went, there's just no confidence left for this team to be able to pull off of. But for Gen.G, you know, this is a really good win. You're showing that you are the better team. You just got to keep things rolling. If you can do this for 2 more games, it's going to be a quick and easy day for you. So who's going to be able to win game 2? Are things going to get tied up, or is Gen.G going to continue their dominance? Well, the winner of game number 2 was Gen.G. They are able to take the second game of the series. They're able to go up 2-0 here, and man, it's just not close. It is an absolute destruction again here in game number 2. It feels like good plays are few and far between for Cloud9 in this series. This is just not even a particularly interesting series to watch up until this point. I like Gen.G's draft. C9's draft is so bold. Like, I get it. It's a lot of comfort for a lot of these players. It's Eminus on his LeBlanc. It's Blabber on something he can try to take the game over on. Fudge did really well on Cassante throughout the whole year, but none of these picks have any synergy. And Gen.G with the R5 Vex just completely obliterate this draft. And obviously, you know, me personally, I love seeing Vex in pro, me being a Vex player myself, but it's just, I mean, Vex in particular just destroys this entire team comp, and there's really not a lot that Cloud9 can do about it. Add that on to the fact that Gen.G is just the better team by, like, a considerable margin, and there's just not a lot of ways to get back into this, especially once early game goes awry. But let's go ahead and talk about how we ended up getting there. Like I said, early game very much did go awry for Cloud9. Gen.G with another good early game lead, and like I said before, if they get this in a game, they're probably just going to win, because they're arguably the best mid to late game team fighting team in the entire world, and really their only weakness, Gen.G, up until this point has been the fact that they're really not all that consistent in the early game. They aren't able to generate a lot of crazy leads because they don't look for a lot of super aggressive plays in the early part of the game. But if Cloud9's just going to hand them a bunch of gold at the beginning of the game, it's going to be a pretty easy one for Gen.G to be able to move forward in, and that's exactly what happened. They were just better, not only positioning-wise, macro-wise, but they were better in fights, even in isolated 2v2s or 3v3s or whatever. Really nice Delight engage early on to get first blood, and then Blabber ends up dying at Herald. Just compounding factors basically everywhere on the map to be able to get Gen.G into a position where even going into the early part of the mid-game, they're already winning by a considerable amount, and they have the tempo, and so, you know, if you're the better team, and that's already happening in the early to mid-game, it's going to be a little bit of a problem. Massive fight for Gen.G at around 18-ish minutes. C9 looks completely lost in this fight. They just don't look like they have a lot of confidence left in them. They're very scared to go and try and make plays, and really the only one who doesn't seem to be playing scared is Eminus. Like, he's the only one who's really stepping up and trying to do a lot of things. Now, that's not to say the other players aren't stepping up, but it doesn't really feel like they have a lot of purpose behind their actions, and that's definitely shown off in this fight where Gen.G just absolutely obliterate them. Now, credit to Cloud9. They do have a pretty good fight mid lane that ends up in like a 2-for-1 around 19-ish minutes, which is not bad. Eminus actually does a really good job jumping on the backline and is able to get a kill off of it, but they're just not really able to transition that into anything. It's their only 2 kills of the entire game that come in that fight, and they still lose Fudge on the back half of it for it, and then you know, eventually, Gen.G just has better macro. They get 2 inhibs basically for free because Cloud9 is a little bit too far forward, and they know that they can just transition their lead down towards the bot side of the map. And then in the final Baron fight here of the game here at 24, 25 minutes, Gen.G just absolutely obliterate them. They end up acing them. They just skip the Baron altogether because they know they can just walk down into the enemy base and end the game. It's just a destruction. It's not close, and it's not fun. Like, even if you're not an NA fan, it's not like these games are particularly interesting. It's not like there's a lot going on. It's just Gen.G being significantly better. Player of the game for me is going to go to Delight again. He's actually been really good across both of these first 2 games. He's very much been a recon connoisseur in the past, especially with this time on Bro. It's good to see him bring it back out here on Gen.G. I think adding that along to the dive of like Wukong and then the Vex, you know, I think there's a lot of really interesting synergy here. They never really got to use the combo because there was never really a position where the backline was going to survive long enough or even was backline long enough to be able to dive on top of them. But it's a really interesting thought, and it's a really interesting idea in isolation. And, you know, maybe they'll be able to pull this out later in the tournament as well. But really like how Delight's been able to play. Chovy on the Vex was really fun to watch. Second game in a row where he's down in CS but up in pressure. That's not the Chovy I know and love, but it's good to see it. Really good plays from him. Peanut is also really, really good. He's really, really good at League of Legends. His Wukong was very difficult to deal with. Doran was fine in the top lane. Pays was fine at AD carry. Gen.G were just the better team. They won everywhere, in every lane, across every part of the map, and it was pretty dominant. As for Cloud9, they're just not good enough to be here. Like, they're just not good enough to be able to face a team like Gen.G, and that's really where the West is at right now. Cloud9, in my opinion, was clearly the best team coming out of NA. They were clearly the most dominant team, and honestly, I think they'd be able to compete with a team like G2, but that, to me, just shows the difference, right? G2 got blasted by Gen.G. Yes, they were able to take a game, but again, I can't reiterate enough that a lot of that, you know, go watch the 3 games they lost. None of them were close, right? Like, getting 1 game is great, but you got to be able to stay consistent. It just doesn't feel like any of them are close, and that was the case here. Berserker's kind of been the shining light for Cloud9 throughout the tournament. He was kind of bad in this game. It feels like he's turned his brain off. It feels like he's just trying to play with his hands now, and that's not really going to work against a team like Gen.G. He was just way too far forward in a lot of instances, but realistically, this could also go to Blabber. The 2 players that have really brought Cloud9 to this point were the 2 players that held them back the most in game number 2, in my opinion, but nobody was good. Fudge hasn't been good. Sven hasn't been good. Eminus has had some moments. Again, he got the solo kill in game 1, and he really was the source of the only good play here in game number 2, and he was up in CS because he didn't really do anything, but he's also giving over a ridiculous amount of mid lane pressure because, again, he's not really doing anything, and so just a lot of negatives for Cloud9. Not really a way back into the series, in my opinion. They're probably just hoping that they can get anything in game number 3 to not make it a complete blowout, but if they win a game, I'd be surprised with the way that they're playing at this moment, and Gen.G just looks utterly dominant. They are controlling every part of the map, early, mid, and late game, not giving over anything for Cloud9 to be able to take, and that's exactly what you want to see from one of the best teams in the world. And so, are they going to be able to complete the sweep in a pretty dominant fashion, or is C9 going to, you know, say like, hey, you know, we're at the very least alive here. We at the very least can step up and play 1 game against you guys. Well, the winner of game number 3 was Gen.G. They are able to take game number 3. They're able to close out this series in a very quick 3-0 sweep, and man, this one was just not very close. It was not a super long series. I mean, this was probably the closest game of the 3. At least Cloud9 was willing and able to try and fight back in this one with a couple of good plays, but Gen.G was the better team by a ginormous margin, and it wasn't particularly close. I wish I could say something that would be positive towards Cloud9, and we'll get into some of the good plays that they made throughout this game as we go on, but really when the grand scheme of this series was Cloud9 getting absolutely destroyed by a really, really good team, one of the best teams in the world in Gen.G, and there really wasn't a lot that they could actually do about it. So let's go ahead and talk about game number 3 in particular. Gen.G do get another early game lead. That's the 3rd one of the series. And remember, this is their weakest part of the game, is the early game, or at least that's what it was in the LCK. They struggled to be able to generate a lot of crazy early game leads, especially in the playoffs, but it didn't really matter because their mid to late game was so consistent that they could play from neutral or behind better than a lot of teams could play from ahead. And so if you're giving them leads in the early game, you're giving them a free path into basically controlling everything that happens the rest of the game. And that's exactly what happened here. Most of the early game advantage, I will say, is Blabber being taken advantage of in the jungle. And this is the problem with picking something like Lee Sin, Lucian Nami, is you really need to win this early game. You're relying so hard on being able to win this early game, but the plays and the pressure that were being created on the map were not being created by you, and so there really wasn't a lot you could do. Lee Sin was consistently out of position, and he was taken advantage of for it. Even by the time we hit, like, the late early game, like, early mid-game, whatever you want to call it, we're seeing Peanut full invade Blabber and just solo kill him in his own jungle, which is just a disaster. If you're a Lee Sin, your game is completely over at that point. There's really just not a lot that you can do. And Blabber had a bad one. We will continue to talk about him. I will say, though, I said this earlier, like in the beginning section of this, but this was probably the closest game of the series, even with Gen.G being able to generate that early lead, because C9 actually fought the mid-game fights relatively okay. They were down a ton of gold, but these fights were super scrappy, and they took forever to complete, and a lot of that was positive for Cloud9. A lot of that meant that they could trade back a lot of these kills. The first big one was in the mid lane, where it was just play after play after play, and someone's dying, and then, 30 seconds later, another person's dying, and then 30 seconds later, another person's dying. And it's really not an awful trade for Cloud9. In fact, I would argue that especially with the gold state and the map state, that they were coming out on top in a trade like that. We had another one where C9 did find a kill in the mid lane, but, Gen.G ends up flanking them. These fights in isolation aren't great for Cloud9, but they're certainly not bad, especially when the game state is the way that it is. Gen.G's lead does continue to grow, but at the very least, Cloud9 is getting something back. They have an opportunity to continue playing. The problem is that Chovy really isn't in a lot of these fights. As good as he is in this game, and we'll talk about that, a lot of his early game is spent, powering up, and then, eventually we get to see Chovy Ahri later in the game, which obviously is famous at this point, but where the game really starts to fall off the rails for Cloud9 is unfortunately when Fudge gets caught right before the Baron dance, and Gen.G is able to take that basically for free. Fudge was really the strongest member on the side of Gen.G at this point. He was able to solo kill Doran in the top lane, which was awesome. Most of that was Doran playing bad, and Doran had a bad game. I'm going to be entirely honest. He didn't play particularly well in this game number 3, but Fudge was definitely, the big carry for Cloud9 in this game, and when he got caught right before Baron, it was pretty doomed for them. They give up the Baron, Gen.G ends up marching into the base, they win one last fight in the base, and they are able to end the game, and they are able to end the series with a 3-0 sweep. It's good stuff from Gen.G. It's about as clinical and about as clean as you could have asked for. Yes, game 3 was a little bit of a fiesta, but at the end of the day, it still was a lot of good things from the side of Gen.G, mostly Chovy in the mid lane. You can't give him Ahri. You just can't give him this champion. He is different. Like, I know a lot of people criticize the Everfrost build, and he didn't go it in this game, but Chovy can build whatever he wants on Ahri, because big magical secret here, if you hit your abilities, you're gonna do a lot of damage. Like, a lot of Ahris, will hit a good amount of Qs, but not like a ridiculous amount of especially Q2s, and that's where a lot of your damage is gonna be coming, and, it's okay, if you built, full damage, you're gonna be able to kind of mitigate that, missing every once in a while, but if you build Everfrost, you can't really afford for it to miss. But the trick is, if you just hit all your Qs, even if you build no damage, it's still gonna hurt a shit ton. And that's what we got with Chovy in this game. He's just unfair on this champion. His movement, his damage, his positioning, his aggressiveness, all of it is just perfect. He was basically 12 CS per minute this entire game. Like, everything you could have asked for, every Chovy, thing that, everything that you attribute to Chovy was definitely accessible in this game. It was definitely there. Peanut was also really good. He was by far the better jungler, not only in this game, but across this entire series. He continued to be really good. And my player of the series is actually going to go to Delight in the support position. I thought his first 2 games were really good. His Thresh in this game was also good. He was playing it more aggro and less for the peel, which was definitely the right choice considering how aggressive this game ended up going, and that Paze really wasn't like a major threat outside of the Jinx rockets, which were everywhere on the map, but overall, everybody on Gen.G played well, maybe with the exception of Doran, who did run it a bit in game number 3. But it's fine, you can kind of live with that, especially how the game turned out. And then for Cloud9 on the other side, they're just not as good as Gen.G. They just weren't going to be able to compete ever on this level. Dud of the game's going to go to Blabber. He had a pretty miserable series, if we're being entirely honest. Just completely gapped by Peanut in basically all 3 of the games that they played. Far from the only player who played bad. Fudge was really bad in games 1 and 2, even if he was really good here on the Kennen in game number 3, or at least better than the rest of his teammates. Eminus was good in games 1 and 2, but was not really all that influential on the Cassante in this one. And Berserker and Sven took a major step back in this series. This is maybe the worst series that I've ever seen these two play as a duo in the bot lane. Sven was miserable. One of the worst performances of the entire tournament in this series, and Berserker, probably his worst series as a member of Cloud9. I mean, just not very good from either of them, but what can I say? I'm not really all that surprised. They're going against one of the best teams in the world, and this is officially where they're knocked out of the tournament. Now, the West is done. The only 4 teams left in the tournament are from either the LCK or the LPL. Not to say we're entirely surprised, but, you know, this is just the world we live in. The top 2 regions are the best by a considerable margin, and that was only further proven by this series. Now, Gen.G has an interesting task ahead of them, facing off against Billy Gaming. We'll cover that when we get to the bracket, or at least preview that a little bit here, but overall, this series for Gen.G has to be at least a little bit of a confidence builder. Maybe not a huge one, because you probably knew you were going to slaughter Cloud9, but, you know, being able to beat a team as solidly as you were able to beat a team in like they did in this series, it's got to at least give you some level of confidence moving into the next round. All right, but that is going to do it for my MSI Day 8 overview and analysis. Gen.G versus Cloud9 is in the books. We've got our final 4 here. T1 and JDG in the upper bracket, BLG and Gen.G in the lower bracket. Definitely a lot of interesting matchups coming up. We've got T1 JDG tomorrow, which is certainly going to be a fun series to cover, and obviously my bracket so far has gone exactly to predictions. There has been no upsets, and not that it's really all that surprising that there are no upsets, but if you watch that bracket video, you'll know that I predicted T1 to win this series in the upper bracket. You know, I think that they're going to be able to move on to the finals, but as you know, I have JDG winning the whole tournament, being able to beat T1 in the finals, and so I could see either team going over here. I'm going to stick to my guns, and I'm going to predict T1 in 5. I think this should be a really fun series. This is the one we've all been most looking forward to. These are pretty clearly, in my opinion, the 2 best teams in the world. You can definitely throw Gen.G into that mix. They're the 3 best teams in the world, but to me, skill-wise, T1 versus JDG is the one that I'm most interested in seeing, and we get it tomorrow. So let me know what you guys think of that series down in the comment section below. Of course, also let me know what you thought of Gen.G Cloud9. Let me know what you thought of this video as a whole. If you did enjoy it, hit that like button. It really does mean a lot for the channel. Not only does it let me know that you guys are enjoying the content, but it helps get this video out to a lot more people. Of course, if you are new here, hit that subscribe button. We're posting about every single day of MSI action, and it really only heats up from here with all the Eastern teams going head-to-head now. We get LCK versus LPL matchups, and that's really what we're all looking forward to. So if you're interested in that coverage, hit that subscribe button and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos go live. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all later.